Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending upon your time zone. We hope you're doing well and looking forward to a 3-day weekend with your family. My name is Jane Walker, and I'm with the family-run Executive Director Leadership Association, otherwise known as FREDLA, and I am pleased to be the moderator for this webinar today. This webinar was first presented in April with over 1,000 people on the webinar. Unfortunately, due to the capacity of the platform, many people were not able to get on the webinar. And so by popular demand, we decided to repeat the webinar with the same outstanding presenters. So welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time, and to those of you who might have been on the April webinar, we encourage you to stay with us, as some parts of the presentation we were not able to complete in the allotted time frame. So there will be additional material presented. We're all experiencing some level of trauma today. You might hear one of my kids is actually banging on the door. I apologize for that. So some of us have more trauma than others, especially those who have been directly affected by COVID. So in many ways, all of us can only imagine how our young children are trying to make sense out of our world today. And thus, our topic could not be more timely. At this time, I would like to turn it. Could go to the next slide, please. Okay. So our presentation is being hosted by the National TA Network for Children's Behavioral Health and sponsored by the National Early Childhood Family Network. Next slide. So during our presentation today, we'll learn lots of things about understanding and appreciating how trauma impacts the development and mental health of infants and young children, gain knowledge of examples to support the implementation of EBPs, and also hear from caregivers on their perspectives and experience. Next slide. I'd like to turn it over to David Armstrong, who is co-chair of the steering committee for the National Early Childhood Family Network, who will give you a little background on the network. David?
Thank you, Jane. And again, hello, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. My name is David Armstrong from the Steering Committee, co-chair of the National Early Childhood Family Network from New Jersey. I just want to thank everyone for taking time out from their busy schedule to join us, to spend some time with us. And also, I'd like to apologize for the ones who tried to get on in April. We was built to capacity, as Jane said. I don't have the dates in front of me, but I believe it was July 2 years ago. We all met down in Washington for the, excuse me. We're just a National Early Childhood Family Network, family-driven. We started from Project Launch, and we continue the work that we're doing with Project Launch as a core principle. Again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you so much. Hopefully we'll get to see our video. Thank you so much, Jen.
Thank you, David. All right, we're going to go ahead and show the video. If for any reason the video is not working, we're going to try our best. But if it does not work, we will happily provide the link so you can watch the video at a later date. Thank you. Okay, it sounds like we're having issues with audio. I'm going to try this one more time. Thanks so much for your patience, everyone.
Most of it is that we all started by telling our story. So we tell craft your story because each of you have a power.
Project Launch is very important to our children, our grandchildren.
Okay, I apologize, everyone. It sounds like the video quality is not good. So we will definitely send that link out to everyone so you can watch the video. Thanks again so much for your patience and understanding.
Thank you, David. And we can send out the link to the video. It's certainly worth watching. Next slide. So in the world of early childhood mental health, we could not have a better panel of experts with us today. Vidana Williams is also on the steering committee for the National Early Childhood Family Network. Lauren Rabinowitz is the program director for the Center of Excellence for Infant and Early Childhood Mental Health Consultation at Georgetown. And Kate Wasserman is co-director of the Parent Infant Early Childhood Program at the Institute for Innovation and Implementation at the University of Maryland. It is my privilege to turn it over to Lauren.
All right, well, thank you so much. So Kate and you will hear from us more in just a few minutes, but we wanted to take just one moment to let you know about the Early Childhood System of Care Learning Community that has been in existence for several years. Anyone who's on this webinar today would be a great candidate for the learning community because we have one criterion for joining, and that's having an interest in early childhood. From the systematic point of view all the way up to the implementation of an evidence-based practice. So we will be following up after this webinar with ways to connect and join that learning community. So we just want to let you know that that is a resource. Back to you, Jane.
A poll for you, a very short poll. Sarah, could we bring up the poll? So we'd love to know your role. Those of you who are with us today, are you parent, caregiver, advocate, clinician, policymaker, or in some other capacity? And let's just see, there are about 1,000 people on the call right now. So let's just see where everybody falls in these categories. Sarah, I'm not able to see the poll, so when it's completed, are you able to bring it up?
Yes, absolutely. We have, let's see, we have about 200 people completing it as we speak.
Okay.
And I can share the results with everyone when we're complete.
Okay. I think we'll give it just a few more seconds. I don't think we need the whole time. Okay, Sarah, where are we now?
Okay, I can go ahead and close the poll and we can see the results.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the system's giving folks 10 more seconds to submit their answers.
Okay. Haven't we all learned more about technology in the last few weeks? Okay. So we have a lot of people in the other category, and it's very interesting to know what that includes. A lot of clinicians, advocates, and many family members as well. That's great. That's great. And hopefully in the chat box, as you introduce yourself, you will tell us what that other means and what capacity you're working with early childhood or your interest in this webinar. Okay, next slide. All right. The voices of families are at the heart of all work with children, young, old, and even adults. Our children are part of our families. Vidana Williams is a family member and is with us today to share her story that is compelling, courageous, and filled with grace. Vidana, can I turn it over to you?
Yes, thank you, Jane. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm so grateful for this opportunity to share with you my personal childhood trauma experience. My hope is that you will be able to pick apart my experience and correlate certain aspects with the information that will be shared later in the webinar, as well as be able to show that those childhood traumatic experiences really does have an impact on you in adulthood. So I hope to paint a vivid picture of my experience as I share it more like a chapter in the book of Vidana's life. So let me start off by giving you a little background. I was born in Atlanta, Georgia, April 14th, 1979. I just celebrated my 41st birthday, quarantine birthday, so it was really nice last month. But my family and I lived in Georgia until I was 5 years of age. So that right there ought to send a red flag, because I remember events in my life that still have an impact till this day that would be deemed traumatic looking back. So here I am between the ages of 4 and 5, and I am the baby of the family. I have an older brother and sister, and I lived in a 2-parent home, grew up a PK, as they all call preacher's kid. So we really spent a lot of time in the church. Both parents went to school to be educators. My dad was also a disabled vet, so he really ran a tight ship, being a military man and a preacher, but life was good for me. My dad was one of those who was deemed a big dreamer with big ideas that was always outside of the box. So, but we know that that type of person back then was not always accepted when you were supposed to be following the guidelines set in a denominational church. So growing up, my traumatic experiences came from outside my immediate family unit. What I mean by that is that I witnessed a lot of attacks on my parents that I didn't quite understand as a child, why things were happening to my family by people we loved. There were times when I would hear my dad on the phone and remind you as caregivers, we do need to know that just because children are not in the room with you does not mean they are not listening. So I was that type of child that some might call nosy, but I call myself very inquisitive. And that is my story, and my mom is not here, so I can stick to that. But there were several times I would sit on the steps and listen to my dad because he had this loud projected voice. But I knew how he sounded when he was upset versus just excited. I knew my dad was speaking on the phone upset this time. Then I would hear my mother crying, and I didn't understand that things are happening that were out of everyone's control. I remember going to church one Sunday, and an uproar started. And I remember one by one people standing up and shouting at my dad in the pulpit as he was preaching. And I remember him beckoning for the people not to do this in front of the children. I remember my mom leaving the piano crying, getting someone to grab us up and rush us downstairs of the church. And I became so fearful that my dad was up there being attacked and something will happen to him. I remember my siblings and I comforting each other as we heard all of the rants and the raves from the people we loved. Is this what happens with people you love? Why are they doing this? Do they not like us anymore? I remember returning home and smiling and saying to my parents, let's just all get into bed together and go to sleep together, as if that would solve all my parents' problems. But in my own little way, if we could just comfort each other and create that safe place with each other, all of the bad problems would go away. I remember my parents smiling at me and allowing me to get into bed with them, granting me that wish, but no, that did not solve the cares of my parents. It continued until my family was asked to leave the church, leave everything I ever known, leave the house that I have memories in, leave the school I started attending, leave the church family that was supposed to love us. Is this what happens? Is this what people do that love you? Well, we had to relocate into an apartment on the other side of Atlanta. So many uncertainties. Is this our new norm now? So during this time, I started to show signs of trauma. I started wetting the bed every single night. I also started having the same reoccurring nightmare. This is of a man entering our old home. I could never see this man's face, just a dark silhouette. We were always running, trying to get away. And he ended up catching my father, and I always witnessed him being murdered. And then somehow we would get away and make it into the garage, but the garage door was always closing. And just as my siblings and myself would make it out, my mom would always fall down and the door would close down with the silhouette of the man standing over her. And my dream would just cut off. I would awake and change my bed because it was wet, and I would climb into the bed with someone else. Could you imagine reliving this dream as a 5-year-old over and over again? Not once did my parents get on to me about wetting the bed. Maybe they did understand something was going on with me and just allowed me to sleep with them. Well, we then relocated to Tuscaloosa, living with my maternal grandparents. I was not used to them at all because remember, I was born in Atlanta and that's all I knew. So it took some getting used to them telling us we can't run around in the house and we can't be loud, you know how children do. Maybe now things though can kind of get to normal and my parents would be happy. Well, little did I know this would not be that kumbaya moment they needed. I was too young to understand what we deem in-law drama. But I would still hear my dad upset and my mom crying. How could this be? How did this follow us here? How could they still be unhappy? I remember one day my parents left the home and my granddaddy asked us to sit down and be still. Well, we did, but being young children, 6, 7, and 10, Sitting down, being still and quiet, would be a chore. So I remember picking with my sister and her telling me to stop. And I remember my granddaddy reiterating that he told us to be quiet and be still. Well, I stopped, but then I started picking with her again. And then it happened. I witnessed my granddaddy reach over in anger and with his open hand slap my sister across the face. We all started to cry. My grandmother rushed and grabbed my sister and started trying to stop the swelling on her cheek. Oh no, I did this. I caused my sister to be hurt by someone who loved us. Is this what happens when someone who loves you gets angry? We were still crying as my parents walked into the house. And I know I caused this whole thing. Everyone is screaming. Daddy is pacing and crying. Mama is crying. Granddaddy is still angry and fussing. Daddy is just screaming, why? Why did you hit my baby? Oh, I'm so sorry. I did this. But wait, why are we packing? Are we leaving again? Where are we going? What is happening? Daddy is crying uncontrollably, and little did I know that Daddy was a victim of child abuse, and he was reliving his own trauma in that moment. We left with all of our clothes, not knowing where we were going, and ran into a lady that said, come see this trailer that is on my property. I have been wanting the family to stay in it. You guys can move in today. Today. Yay, Daddy. Said we have a place to live. So we lived there for a few years and would see my grandparents drive by and stop and watch us play. Are they coming to hurt us? Are they coming to make my dad and mom cry again? So during the next few years, I continued to wet the bed until I was about 10 or 11 years old. My dad and mom took me to the doctors to see what was wrong, but they could not find anything internally wrong with me. The doctors even suggested doing exploratory surgery. My parents changed my diet, hoping that would help, but it never did. I continued to have the same nightmare, not as often, but often enough. I continued wetting the bed until we bought a home, and I felt secure in the fact that no one would make us leave. This is our home, and Daddy and Mama were finally happy again. And Daddy started his own church, and they loved him. And Mama decided to homeschool us, and we were good. I felt safe with them. Did I still jump in the bed with them? Yes, from time to time. Then, 41 years later, looking back, we asked, what impact does these traumatic experiences have on me today? Well, we remain a close-knit family, and we still create that safe place for each other. And even though we meet no strangers, and we will love you to death, it is still hard to let people into our family circle. Because remember, I learned early on that outside people who love you will hurt you and make you cry. I have always been the child that was going to fix your unhappiness. We can fix it together. Now, I know that is not by cuddling up in the bed, but all through my life, I have never wanted to leave home. Even when I got married, I tried to convince my parents to let us stay. When my dad died in 2007, guess what the first thing we did as a family leaving the hospital? My mom, siblings, and I got in my mom's room and fell asleep, 2 on the floor, 1 in the chair, and mom in the bed. This is how we have always comforted each other. It has never changed. And guess who never left mama's sad? Me. Yes, I have never left this house since. My husband sold our house and we moved in to care for mama. When I am faced with stressful times in my life that I don't have control over, I still have the same nightmare. But now my dad is replaced with my husband, and my children and I are running away from this dark silhouette of a man. And no, I can't jump in the bed with my mom. But I do use my husband as my personal binky, and he knows it. We have had this discussion. And I will awake from the nightmare, snuggle up under him and say, put your arms around me. I had a nightmare, and then I feel safe. So yes, I am 41 years old, and I recognize these behaviors stem from my childhood trauma experiences. And learning about this in depth has helped me to do some self-evaluation, as well as being more aware for my children's sake. So again, I hope my story will help you have something to correlate with what is being shared today. And I thank you guys for lending an attentive ear to what I had to share. Thank you. And now I will hand it over to Lauren.
Thank you so much for sharing, Vidana. I hope everyone can hear me okay. We truly, truly appreciate your generosity and your powerful words. I know all of us on the webinar are appreciative of your sharing. I am lucky enough to be hearing your story for the second time, and it is so, so impactful. So thank you so much. We are going to leave some time at the end of our presentation for comments and for questions from you all, so we will continue going. Please do continue to utilize the chat. We are watching it, we are responding. So we are, yes, there's some instructions about the chat. Let us know if you have any concerns with it, but we are going to keep moving. So thank you again so much, Vidana. All right, so once again, my name is Lauren Rabinowitz, and I am really excited to be with you all this afternoon. I am based in Washington, D.C., and it is a very rainy Friday before Memorial Day weekend here, and this is actually the perfect place to be for me. We are going to start with a quick poll right now. So Sarah, are you able to pull that poll up? Okay, so here we are asking if you can please rate your comfort in recognizing signs and symptoms of trauma in young children. So as Jane had explained when she went over the way this webinar is going to work, we started with hearing from Vidana. I'm going to give some overview of recognizing signs and symptoms of trauma in young children, and then I will be passing the presentation over to Kate, who will be going further in depth on some really wonderful strategies and evidence-based and evidence-informed practices to support young children and families. We did want to get a little bit of information from you all about where we're starting from. What is your comfort? I will let you all take a moment to complete that poll. I don't see I guess like Jane, I don't see it being completed. So Sarah, how are we doing? Are folks filling it out?
Yep, we have about 20 folks filling it out as we speak.
Great. Well, I'll keep chatting for a minute to let everyone have some time to complete that. Just a couple notes before we dive into content. We created this presentation before we were in a COVID world, even before we did our first presentation, which was mid-April. But the information is still really relevant. It's very applicable to this crisis that we're in. So we will certainly pull in relevant moments. We'll point out when something is really relevant. Again, please utilize the chat. Let us know if there's something you want us to go deeper in our present circumstances. I also want to note that this is a high-level overview. We could spend days and days talking about signs and symptoms of trauma. So we will be sharing lots of resources with you if you would like to go deeper. We'd be happy to connect with you if you want more information or more ideas. I also want to note that a lot of this information comes from colleagues of mine from the National Center on Health and Wellness. It's one of the technical assistance centers for Head Start grantees. The last thing I want to note is that we know that there's lots of webinars out there. You certainly might have had the opportunity to be on a webinar and hear some of this information. So if this is not new information for you today, I'd love you to think about how you might use the information to impact your work, impact your home life, or just think about a new way to apply the information if some of this is a review. Okay, Sarah, why don't we stop the poll and see how folks rated themselves. And I do see a comment, by comfortable, do you mean knowledgeable? I would say yes, and sorry, I probably should have answered that sooner, but let's go ahead and see what everyone had to say. Sarah?
Okay, can you see the results?
Oh, there they are, absolutely. Okay, so it looks like we have a distribution fairly even, so almost half, about 42% did feel comfortable, and then the next biggest percentage is 30% felt kind of in the middle, and not too many were all the way at the uncomfortable range. So that's great to hear that we have a whole range of folks on the call today. So thank you so much for participating in that, and we are going to keep moving. So I would like to let's start really simple about the definition of trauma. On the next slide, I'm going to give you our definition, but before I pull that up, if you could take a moment and write into the chat, what comes up for you when you think about the word trauma? Someone were asking you how you would define it in just a few words or a sentence. If you would be willing to put that in the chat, so it's really informative to see how folks would answer that question. I'll give you a minute to put that in. Someone is saying a hurtful event, anything that affects a child in a negative way, hurt, yeah, absolutely. Experience that affects you physically, mentally, or spiritually in a negative way, absolutely. This is, really helpful. Lots of events. Okay, so so what is trauma? What comes up? So we often think of events or experiences such as the death of a loved one, separations. Certainly our current situation and all the implications of COVID may come up for you when you hear the word trauma. So the definition that we are working with today is what you see here on the screen. So trauma occurs when frightening events or situations overwhelm a child's ability to cope or deal with what has happened. So the key piece here is what we are talking about when we talk about trauma. We're talking about the ability to cope or deal with the event and a little bit less about the event itself. So two important notes about this. So one, not all kids react to traumatic events in the same way. What can seem really daunting for some kids may be less challenging for other kids to deal with. Something else to keep in mind is the difference in how adults and children process and experience trauma. Everyone on the call can probably relate to this. I know for me, the way my husband and I are experiencing this current very stressful and traumatic situation looks very different from our 3-year-old. So thank you all for participating in the chat and sharing that. So hopefully that definition is pretty clear to you. All right, so we are going to be very optimistic here about technology, and we are going to try a video again. If it doesn't work, again, we will share the link with you. It's a long video, but we are going to try and just watch about the first couple of minutes. So let's cross our fingers and see if it works.
ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and that comes from a seminal study that was done in
Thank you so much for playing that video, Sarah, and I'm sorry for those of you that weren't able to see or hear. We'll absolutely send you the link. It's in the slides where you will be able to view the whole slide. I'm sorry, the whole video. And I did want to quickly just note, I see that someone put in a question a few moments ago asking about how volunteers can recognize trauma when serving the public during these times. I think that's a great question. I think some of the content that we talk about, we'll get to it, but remind us at the end if you don't feel like that question was answered, and we can definitely go deeper on that. All right, so thank you all for those of you that were able to watch the video for watching, and for those that were not, thank you for your patience. So you heard in that video a bit about the ACEs study, which might have been a review. What I would love to spend a moment on now is bringing your attention to a newer application of the ACEs study. So Dr. Roy Wade Jr. has developed a framework to expand ACEs to reflect life situations and experiences beyond those that were covered in the original study. So that original study, the ACEs study, was the study participants consisted primarily of middle-class Caucasian Americans. 75% were Caucasian and only 4.5% identified as Black. So this missed some really important events. What Dr. Wade's work does now is he has included adversities such as community violence, discrimination, and racism. Those were not included in the original study. So the point of ACEs and this newer application is the same. Early experiences matter in both the short and long term. What's so important is to examine the full breadth of those types of events that can cause later life health challenges. So I encourage you all to learn more about his work if you are not familiar with it. I found it really, really eye-opening. All right, so moving on, let's talk a bit about historical trauma and intergenerational trauma. So what does this mean? This occurs when traumatic experiences are not resolved or processed, and so the ramifications pass down from generation to generation. Basically what this means is that the impacts of a trauma may be felt, even if not directly experienced. So some common examples of historical trauma include slavery, genocides, massacres, forced relocation, and of course, pandemics. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into tons of detail about this topic, which is a really, really important topic, and I'm not trying to shortchange it. So again, let us know if you'd like some more resources in the chat. But what I do want to say is, for purposes of this webinar, for those working with or parenting young children, we need to give voice to why this current situation is so challenging and give ourselves permission to feel what we are feeling. I believe Jane said it in the beginning of this webinar. I'll say it again. What we all are living through right now is a trauma. Our brains are adjusting to get us through it. It's very normal to have some feelings of numbness, hypervigilance, anxiety. Most of us are not really able to process a lot right now. It's more the getting through it modality. And so given that understanding, it's okay and smart to lower expectations and be as kind to yourself as possible. The good news, and what I really want to highlight here on this slide, is that we have the opportunity for healing, and we can hope to try and ameliorate intergenerational trauma. So big question, how do we do that? It's basically we reduce the transmission from generation to generation through processing and giving space. So again, lots more that we could say on that. Please connect with us if you would like to go deeper into this really important topic of intergenerational trauma, which, lots of these examples that we hear about, it's like, oh, that happened a long time ago, but no, we are living through one right now. All right, so let's get even more concrete and really think about what all of this looks like. So there is a lot listed here on this slide, which is signs and symptoms of trauma in infants and toddlers. So what's really important when looking at this list is to recognize that these signs and symptoms in young children, things like eating and sleeping challenges, being clingy, some of these other behavioral issues, irritability, not able to soothe, perhaps some developmental regressions or language concerns, aggression. These behaviors, they can look like a lot of different things. Some are the result of typical child developmental milestones. Sleep regression in a baby can be very normal, sadly. So our job as attentive adults is to be curious and wonder about the cause of these different behaviors. So let's take an example. Let's think about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's a very common diagnosis in young children. So what I want you to think about are some of the shared symptoms between ADHD and childhood trauma. So I'm just going to read you a list of some shared symptoms. Trouble concentrating, difficulty learning, easily distracted, not listening well, disorganization, hyperactivity and restlessness, and problem sleeping. So look at the list on the screen and you will see a lot of similarities. So why does this matter so much? It matters because even when behaviors look similar, we absolutely need to get to the root of the problem so we can get the right support in place. Therapy for trauma is not the same as for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. We need to put our detective hat on and be very careful to get all the information and seek support from the right professionals. So let's move our attention now to thinking a bit about what this means in the learning environment. We absolutely see impacts of trauma in all educational settings, beginning with infants. Many of you may have children at home right now that are showing impacts of trauma. Maybe some of these symptoms and signs that I just discussed feel familiar. There's likely a lot of fear, absolute fear for parents and caregivers that might be essential or frontline workers, certainly for grandparents, elderly neighbors, and fear of getting sick themselves. It's a very scary time, and we need to remember that as we think about educational expectations, we want to hold this in mind. As you know, school doors, I think we know, are probably not sadly reopening for quite some time. But you know, and this is a national webinar. Folks are all across the country, and every state is in a somewhat different place about reopening. But lots of places are starting to reopen, and you know, we as parents are having to make some hard choices, and we want to be really cognizant of what some of these behavioral manifestations in kids might look like as some things start to look a little bit more quote unquote normal. Right, so we have spent a good amount of time talking about what traumatic events are and how those events may be impacting children. Now I want to shift to thinking about how we can help support children. What can we actually do? Someone put in a question about that. What can we do? So here's just a little bit, and again, happy to connect and talk more with anyone later down the road, and Kate is going to get even more specific after I give this general overview. This is probably my favorite slide of the whole slide deck. It says what is more important than I think almost anything else, and that is that healing happens in relationships. This is the positive that we can focus on right now. You all being on this webinar is positive. Whether as a parent, caregiver, educator, policymaker, you are honing your ability to help children and yourself heal from trauma right now. And I cannot possibly overstate the importance of that. So you're like, okay, that's fine. What does that actually mean? Okay, so let's think what we can do as caregivers. So all the information on the next couple of slides, very, very relevant right now as we are all in this traumatic state. Before we talk specific, I again just have to mention that in a longer presentation, we would really go into depth about topics such as the brain and the stress response system. You heard Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris talk about this in the video, about the brain and the fight, flight, freeze response. So the reason, again, that this matters so much is because trauma is literally impacting the brain. The fight, flight, freeze response has an adaptive function, and it has developed over time. But when children and adults are impacted by trauma, the brain gets activated. Not only the brain, but the rest of the stress response system. So that this affects other parts of our body, such as our heart, have an increased heart rate, sweating, stomach constriction, all that. Like think about the last time that you were anxious about something, maybe in a traffic accident, you received some bad news on the phone. We often hear someone reporting that they felt like my stomach was in knots or I couldn't breathe. So that's the stress response system taking over. So when that's happening, let's think about what we can do to help children that might be experiencing some of these symptoms. I find it really helpful to think of concrete strategies. So those listed on this slide and the next, they might seem really simple and basic, but they're very impactful. So we really have one goal here when we are working with children that are in this state. Our goal is to help calm their nervous system. So what are some ways that we can help to calm the nervous system? You can identify a primary caregiver. The suggestion is thinking more about a school environment where there's often more than one adult, many teachers in a room, but absolutely can translate to the home environment as well. To really have that kid the child be able to have a primary caregiver that they can go to. Thinking about physical proximity when that's appropriate. Of course, take into consideration the type of trauma. That might not always be appropriate, but sometimes just that physical closeness is really, really helpful for kids. Talking to kids about their emotions. Do not be afraid to name these hard emotions. And in fact, the more we can talk to kids and help them actually recognize what they're feeling, the better off they are. Certainly being close by as children are interacting with one another. This slide obviously was written before we are in a social distancing world, but I'm sure you can read between the lines of what this is trying to say. And lastly, of course, observing each child's skill. Every child has strengths, and there's always something to build on. So some other strategies to think about, predictable schedules. Kids undergoing stress and anxiety thrive on routine. Whether they're currently activated or not, all kids do well with routine when they have a routine, predictable schedule. Certainly giving choices can be really helpful. Scaffolding decisions, daily activities, anything that might be extra challenging for a child. Certainly giving a quiet space where a child can go to relax and decompress. Of course, take all of these strategies, with age-appropriate limitations and parameters in mind. For children that are sensitive to sensory cues, really want to pay attention to noises and smells that might be overwhelming, and when possible, to create some sort of very low stress environment without a lot of sensory input. So again, these are really simple, practical strategies. Many you're probably already doing, so make sure to give yourself credit. I certainly want to add in that there is a lot of pressure right now on adults to act in just the right way. We've seen these, frankly, silly color-coded schedules on social media. I think now we're starting to recognize that those were really well-intentioned and maybe not all that realistic. But, we're doing the best we can, so please give yourself grace and remember that whether we are in a pandemic or not. All right, so now we're going to continue our journey at the positives and think more about what we can do, and that is thinking about resilience. So what is resilience? Very simply put, it's recovering from or adjusting to change. That ability to bounce back, or a colleague I've heard say several times, the ability to bounce forward. And again, this is talking about resilience is something we could do in a whole couple of hours together. So sorry to shortchange it a little bit, but lots of great resources out there on resilience. So you might have seen this resilience model before and likely are familiar with the idea of risk and protective factors. I really like to think of this as a framework for all trauma work. Our goal is always to increase those protective factors, whether by creating a safe environment in a classroom or helping children feel a little safer during this particular crisis by being able to name their emotions. All humans have different levels of innate resilience, but we can foster greater levels of resilience in everyone. I really like the idea of thinking about our resilience, quote unquote, bank account, and you're wanting to continually make deposits into that bank account so there's lots to borrow from when times are challenging. So we've talked about some of these strategies already, but just a few other things to think through. Making connections. Virtual can be really powerful. Giving your child a sense of efficacy, responsibility, making them responsible for things like hand washing, preparing dinner, all that sort of thing. Again, acknowledging of what is challenging right now, and it's okay to tell your child that this is a hard time for you right now. I'm always looking for ways to maintain hope and being grateful for small wins, taking a nice walk on a nice day. Just slowing down, listening to the birds chirp. My daughter now has a new obsession with wind chimes, so her favorite thing to do is walk around the neighborhood and find all the houses that have wind chimes and listen to the different noises that they make. That transitions us to the last bit that I want to talk with you about, and that is mindfulness. So mindfulness looks different for different age groups, but breathing exercises in yoga, really, really good activities for little ones. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about mindfulness before transitioning. It can be defined in lots of different ways, but mindfulness is essentially a collection of strategies that help train the brain so you are having increased attention and awareness of your own behavior. And this idea that we're talking about, trying to create a sense of calm the nervous system. This is what mindfulness is all about. The National Center on Health and Wellness has a whole suite of mindfulness materials that are designed to help the early childhood education workforce. And I would love for you to visit those materials. I think they're really helpful for now. And, really as we navigate these next few months and, as things are starting to reopen and lots of challenging transitions on the horizon. If we had more time, I would take you through a little mindfulness activity. And I really want to make sure we save some time this time for questions and answers. We didn't have a lot of time for that last time. So right before I transition to Kate, I just want everyone to do a quick check, wondering how your mindfulness is feeling right now. Are you being mindful versus this idea of mindlessness? So this is what lots of us are doing all the time, multitasking, thinking about what's coming up, what are you doing this weekend, what are you doing in the next hour, are you checking your email right now, are you looking at CNN, trying to see what, the phases of reopening look like in your community. I don't say that from a place of judgment whatsoever. I think, are all guilty of this, but just as an opportunity to quickly reflect on what your thermometer of mindfulness is. So thank you all so much for the time. I am now going to transition to Kate.
Great, thank you. And I was, as you were going over the big topic, Lauren, I was watching the chat, and so many of you were sharing many of your personal experiences within your roles with what you've seen with kids in trauma and what have been struggles in terms of responding. So what we wanted to do was give you guys a sense of two different evidence-based practices that are really early childhood and family focused, and importantly, like community-based, because Lauren and I both have a clinical background as clinical social workers who worked in, trauma-informed clinics and settings, and have been embedded within child serving settings as well to deliver those services. And that's really the goal, right, is for a child to not suffer from many of those symptoms that Lauren described before it gets so severe that they have to go to a place called psychiatry or mental health, at the age of 2 or 3 or 4. But really, how do we support the embedding of evidence-based practices within community settings, within childcare, within schools, within pediatric primary care, so that caregivers can have access to support and young kids can have access to support when initial questions are raised. And Lauren, if you want to hop to the next slide, thanks. And this slide, actually, the way that the visual looks, it almost makes it look like these two different EBP practices are facing off against each other, when really they're actually can be very integrated. And this is the field of mental health, evidence-based practices. The list is getting longer and longer, and I think there's been much attention to really, how do we establish fidelity and consistency among these creative and researched informed approaches. So there are many, but we wanted to give you a sense of two that we felt were sort of had many of the core components, which have to do both with supporting clinical providers and supporting caregivers to understand and co-regulate, as Lauren was saying. A lot of the pieces of resilience and trauma recognition exist in both of these evidence-based practices. I'll go over FAN first. So Lauren, if you want to jump to the next slide. So FAN, which stands for Facilitating Attuned Interactions, grew out of what was appropriately named the Fussy Baby Network, which was developed by Linda Gilkerson. She's a professor at the Erickson Institute, which is a graduate school in Chicago. She had some funding that was actually injury prevention funds about over a decade ago now, to look at reducing rates of shaken baby syndrome in the city of Chicago. Parents that were at their wits' end with trying to soothe a baby and would actually put their babies at risk based on their stress responses. So she developed a warm line to really first listen to where parents were, what their concerns were, not first just reassure them that everything was fine, but really kind of understand what their levels of stress were. Because if any of you have seen any of the statistics around the rates of babies crying, it can really be all over the place, and so much of it is tied to what is tolerable for that individual caregiver, depending on their own histories, their own stress management, and their own living conditions, right? So what are sort of things that are making them more sensitive or not? I'm seeing in the chat somebody's asking, what does FAN stand for? So Fussy Baby Network was how it was born, and again, it was a warm line where people could call to get this level of support. And then they really just developed a model around their approach to that warm line that is now a national model called FAN. So FAN is Facilitating Attuned Interactions. And it's kind of grown out of that warm line into an application that has been applied to mental health clinicians, mental health consultants, pediatric primary care and specialty clinics, even those working with DSS, and those working within the legal system to really hold and focus on the parents' concern and support their understanding. If you want to go to the next slide, Lauren. This just shows you quickly where the model itself has been established. So these are the national network sites where there's trainers to support that, the model and its application. And home visiting has been a really strong anchor for this as well. So when the McVie funds came out and were, really supporting the establishment of evidence-based practices in home visiting, a lot of those teams contracted with Linda and her team at Erickson to get FAN training. So it's a training, a reflective practice model that overlays whatever the interventionist is doing. So if the interventionist is delivering child-parent psychotherapy in a clinic, or if they're delivering, parents as teachers curriculum through home visiting, they still follow their own curriculum, but they use this framework to really guide their attention and their work with the family. And that'll make sense once I explain it a little bit more. Lauren, you can jump to the next slide. Just to give you, before I go over the actual intervention itself, this is a little bit about the theory of change, right? So in order to hold this approach, that the FAN approach, you have to really focus on attunement, to understand what the caregiver needs and what their concerns are. And it's perfectly embodied by this Daniel Stern quote here, right? To share in another's experience with no attempt to change what the person is doing or believing. And this comes into play a lot, because a lot of the interventions for caregivers and kids around trauma involves a lot of coaching and adjusting their responses to behaviors, right? But what we want to do first before we do that is really understand where the caregiver is. What's their urgent concern? And how do we not dismiss what they're saying? Not say this is not the worst acting 3-year-old that I've ever seen, but what is it like for you to have a 3-year-old that you feel is so out of control? And really understanding their perspective so that you can support their change in their approach to their child. You can go to the next slide, Lauren. This is the model in its illustration. So as you can see, the goal here is really focusing on the parent's urgent concern. And it starts with a strategy of calming. So Lauren's introduction about mindfulness was the perfect transition here. And what this model does that is different, I think, than many other evidence-based practices that I've had the opportunity to be trained in, is it really focuses on not just what's being said in the room to the caregiver or to the child, but what is it like for the provider, right? So you're starting with mindful self-regulation for yourself so that you can truly attune in a non-distracted way to the caregiver and the child. There's so many things to watch when you're looking at a dyad. And so being settled, having your own mind settled allows you to do that and to really understand the parent's urgent concern. You start then with the next wedge, which is the empathic inquiry or feelings wedge, really focusing not on, all right, what's, how was the homework that since I saw you last, or sort of a task-based thing, but what has it been like for you to be so-and-so's parent since we last met, or what is it like for you to have these concerns about your child's response to what's going on right now? Really understanding what's underlying the referral source, right? Because often there's a lot of, especially in early childhood, when there's still many things being determined about the meaning of a child's behavior, what the trajectory might look like, what other implications might be on deck, as some of you pointed out in your comments. Could this also be, exacerbated by sensory issues, by other learning differences, by underlying anxieties, et cetera? So really understanding what the parent's experience is. Then moving to thinking collaboratively with them, right? So that you're not yet telling them what to do. You're really thinking together about what have they tried, what is their hunch, what's been working, how do we know that? And then moving to doing or capacity building. So once you've really fully thought out with a parent, again, that not just coming to you for an expert recipe on how to respond to a tantrum in that moment, but how do you help them really shape and refine how they're understanding their child and what they think that their child needs. Because the idea is to really grow their capacity, right? You can see the 3 boxes in the bottom. are really what's underpinning this whole thing, right? So to increase parental confidence, to strengthen the parent-child relationship, and to promote healthy development of parents and infants. And I love how it says that, right? Because it's not just healthy development of the child, but it's the parents' their own development of their parenting practices around this child, right? Because even if it's their third or fourth child, if this is a child with a different response to stresses or a different need or a different traumatic experience, they need to be able to develop their own parenting style or approach to that. And that often changes as kids are responding differently to different developmental stages. And then the intention of reflecting, right? So that there's the opportunity to integrate whatever was done during that session, so that the caregiver isn't dependent on you as a co-regulated other in the room to support them to do this, but really, how are they going to plan to practice that approach, or to sort of think about this throughout that time before they see you again. Again, what happens in between their time with us is what this is really rooted on. And you can jump to the next slide, Lauren. And this is a whole, as Lauren was saying before on some of her side, this is a very long and involved training. Usually people get trained in it over the course of 2 days and then have like a 6-month facilitation and supervision period to get certified in this model. So I'm going over this rather quickly, but just to give you a sense of some of the core components of the approach. But what they've learned through the many different applications of this model is that it's really focusing on the provider being where the parent is, right? Seeing and holding the parent's experiences, not trying to convince them otherwise that their child is fine, or that this isn't the worst interaction that they've seen, but okay, I'm understanding how stressful this is for you. I'm not going to talk you out of it. I'm really going to sit with you, stay longer in the hard places, right? So going through the parent's emotions, which we know are so important with respect to how the child is going to be doing, right? So often the child is the port of entry to get us into the world of that family, but within the realm of infant and early childhood mental health, the caregiver functioning, well-being, and mental health status is so important. Again, wanting to see the child that the parent sees, helping the parent find their own way, right? There has to be, if anybody's been to the parenting section of Barnes & Noble, you know that there's many ways to soothe a baby to sleep, or to teach a child to toilet train, or whatever the parenting goal is, right? And so it's not about having them do our way, but it's about how do they have the competence and confidence and skills and developmental expectations to do it in their own way. And to have a model that holds the practitioner, as we said, that we know that work with traumatized families can be traumatizing. And so the importance of having self-reflection is really important. You can go to the next slide. This is also often taught in a supervisor role as well. So the idea is that if a home visiting team is learning this intervention to support their work directly with families, their supervisors are also getting trained in this model, so that their experience in supervision reflects this as well. Again, an example of how it's really trying to hold the practitioners or deliverers of service during this time in a trauma-informed approach. You can go to the next slide, Lauren. A little bit more about trauma-informed practice and FAN. Again, when you're sort of following this model, no matter what the curriculum that you're using, it's really focusing on providing a consistent, predictable structure, inviting collaborative, really helping the parent be part of what happens within the sessions, right? So that it's not just you coming in with your curriculum or your coaching materials. You can still do that, but it's also about like, how do they want to approach this material? What is their main focus that they want to talk about today? And really reinforcing that. A lot of agencies or programs will try to do that initially, and then it gets back into this old sort of like, I'm the expert and I'll tell you how to fix the problem versus really trying to build their own capacity and self-confidence in that area. And then, to not avoid difficult topics, but rather provide a space to acknowledge feelings and parents' inner experiences. We can go to the next slide. So really, the whole goal of this is attunement, right? This idea that as you're giving an intervention, you're really using this fan model to attune to the child and caregiver's needs, right? So what are you observing in the dyad? What are you observing? You know, how are you just being with them and not trying to rush them through this? Because we know that when there's misattunement, there's an increased sense of anxiety, right? Especially for families that have been through trauma. And that's gonna make trying something hard or trying something new harder, right? But if you're with them and you're sitting next to them and they feel connected and seen and acknowledged by you, they're gonna have more guts to try something hard. So the whole idea is really, how do you increase their capacity and their confidence to do so? You can go to the next slide. I'm gonna jump past this one because I want to get to ABC, and as you said, time for questions. So I want to just get through this a little bit. So this is a video, and I don't know if we want to give this a try. I know that some of the videos have been a little bit hard, so maybe we'll just send this out to you guys. But I can give you an overview. So this is Simone, who was a home visitor in Illinois working with Linda's team, and she had a mom who she was, had been home visiting with for about a year. And she came into her home, and she had shared that there had just been another incident of domestic violence, which they had talked about before, but there hadn't really been any movement. And Simone said that she really tried to not go into where her head initially went, which is, why haven't you addressed this? This is so harmful for you and your child, and I know that you deserve better. But really sort of sit with this mom and say, what was this like for you? What are you thinking? How are you feeling, et cetera? And that through that process, and the mom first got, expressed aggravation at some of her family members who did the thing of telling her what to do. And really that the mom opened up about a plan, was able to create a plan with her once she felt heard, right? Which is also what we're trying to get caregivers to do to their kids, right? Help them be heard and seen and acknowledged. The first thing that you want to do with a tantrum or a moment of distress is acknowledge how they're feeling, right? So we really have to be able to do that with caregivers. You can go to the next slide, Lauren. So the other intervention that we wanted to give just sort of a flyover overview of, and happy to provide additional information if helpful, is another trauma-informed evidence-based approach called the Attachment and Biobehavioral Catch-up, or ABC. This was developed by Dr. Mary Dozier out of University of Delaware. And it is a brief intervention that has really, really impressive implications just for promoting resilience and promoting dyadic strength after trauma. So it's focused on caregivers and their babies, infants that are 6 months to 2 years, and they also have a toddler model. Oh, I see it's someone's alma mater. Yeah, that's a great program. Delivered in just 10 in-home sessions. So the idea of doing it within the caregiver's home is a really important component here, because you don't want to remove them entirely from and have them be in this clinical space that feels different anyway, and then it's harder to translate what's taught in the session at home. And that they use in vivo or in the moment commenting. So people get trained as a parent coach to comment in the moment about interactions after there's some education provided to parents or caregivers. And then they watch the videos of the sessions and help caregivers see highlights of, look at that, when you did that, your baby lit up so brightly, and all of those types of things. And there's a lot of evidence that has been built around this model. Lauren, you can jump to the next slide. And you can see here, this is sort of a bit of a logic model for what the intervention does, right? But so the ABC parent coach is doing what they call in the moment commenting, right? So you sort of set up an interaction. One of them is, completing a puzzle, or making pudding with your child, right? An activity that we know is going to be messy. And then really giving the parent in the moment feedback about their moments of nurturance. So when did they see that the child needed calming or soothing or reassurance? When were they able to follow the child's lead and not just be directive or authoritative with their child? And when did they reduce frightening behavior, right? So Dr. Dozier did a lot of studying of parents, this intervention was actually initially built around supporting women that, due to substance use, had been removed from their child's care and were working to reunify. And she saw overall in her study that there was high frightening behavior, so sort of yelling, scolding. It was very hard for those parents to follow the child's lead. Most of the interactions were task-based, diapering, changing, feeding, et cetera, and that there wasn't a lot of nurturance. So when you focus on increasing those three things, reinforced by those in-the-moment comments, the attachment quality was much higher, and the self-regulation in babies became higher because, again, babies are so dependent on co-regulating with their caregiver. You can go to the next slide, Lauren. So the goal here was really to support caregivers understanding what their child's behavior means, right? So some kids give really clear cues, and some kids don't, or not consistently. And so how do you help the parent? All of the in-the-moment coaching is really about helping the parent understand those things. You can go to the next slide. And this is an example of the in-the-moment commenting, right? So you want to always describe what you're responding to. So not give like a random oh, that was a great job with that activity, because the parent doesn't know then what they did really well. But this is an example. So you describe what you're responding to. Oh, when he fell down, you picked him right back up. And then the target was nurturance, right? So that's a beautiful example of nurturance. And then you want to tie it to an outcome, so what that meant for the child. So this will help him learn to trust others as he gets older. And if you watch an ABC interaction, there's the parent coach is talking sort of all the time. The goal is to have one comment per minute, which sounds like a lot, but it becomes very natural when you're in the sessions. You can go to the next slide, Lauren. Oh, and this is missing the picture somehow, but in Baltimore City, we had the opportunity in two different federal, braiding some funding together through two different projects that were actually focused on transition age youth that were parenting, so teenagers and young folks in their young 20s who needed some supports. And so we got 6 parent coaches trained that were already in community-based settings where pregnant women and young parents were, adding ABC to the clinical services that they were offering. And that's been a big success here in Baltimore City for the model. Wanting to open it up now, since we gave you a very high level sort of flyover of 2 different evidence-based practices and then the topic in general. But you guys can either unmute, raise your hand, or type in the chat any reflections or questions that you have. We see one here. So it can be difficult to approach parents directly when it comes to their child. I sometimes use modeling behavior for desired behavior. Yeah, and part of what both the FAN and ABC try to do is really get the parent to do the behavior, because sometimes, so often, when there's been trauma and there's behavioral concerns for young kids, parents don't feel very effective. They don't feel very competent in their role, and so they might come to you with a concern, and to see you be able to, perfectly soothe their child or instruct their child in a way that the cleaning up isn't a tantrum, but they actually comply. Parents with low parenting self-efficacy see that as, oh, see, she can do it, but I can't, right? And so much of the goal is, how do you really explore with a parent, like, what is your theory behind any time that you try to get your child to clean up that he falls down and has a tantrum? Why do you think it's so difficult? What do you think might help? What would it be like for you to try that? And then, all right, I'm going to sit with you while you try it. I'm going to be right here. I'm going to help if it falls apart, but why don't you try that, right? You really want to push ourselves to almost be the Greek chorus for the parent, and help them to really do the thing that we want to have happen in the room, so that it can happen when we're not there as well. But it's a slow process, and parents need a lot of reinforcement and encouragement.
Kate, I think one question has just come through about resources for a 4- and 5-year-old that needs help with trauma. So everyone keeps telling me that they are too young, that they are having a lot of issues. So first of all, you're being quite a model advocate in knowing that that's not true. So that's, I think, an important take-home point for everyone on this webinar, that there really is no too young that are experiencing trauma. Go ahead, Kate. Sorry, I think I was talking.
No, I was going to say, yeah, absolutely. So that, I mean, we know that infants can experience trauma. And often it can be hard because they can't articulate it in the same way, of course. But there's been many clinical studies and brain studies and all of those types of things to really help back up the idea that very young kids can experience trauma, and that they do, and there are interventions that support them. Child Mind Institute has a lot of really great resources for young kids in trauma. Sesame Street has a lot of really great resources that anybody can pick up and watch and support with young kids. There's the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. I don't know what community you're in, but I mean, certainly if you end up talking to a therapist or provider, I think you certainly want to know, like, what have they been trained, what has been their training with respect to very young kids? Are they trained in any evidence-based practices, or do they have training specific to kids below kindergarten, younger than kindergarten?
A question here asking about studies done on trauma of children returning to birth parents that they have not lived with for years, especially for very young children. That's a great question.
Yeah. So there are many studies that are sort of within the world of child welfare, and there's actually the child welfare sort of world has their own list of evidence-based practices. But yeah, I mean, I think that's actually a cohort that there are a lot of studies on. And again, the beautiful and complicated thing about human beings is that they're not an equation, and so it's hard to draw any concrete conclusions on them. A lot of it depends on the capacity of the birth parent. It depends on what supports and interventions have been set up and what that transition looks like. So certainly for any young child, if they haven't seen anybody at all, and all of a sudden you're living with them, that's going to be traumatic. But if there's been sort of a slow and explained reunification process, the way that it's supposed to happen, we know that the kids do best with their families, and that there's still some ongoing support for that family. Yes, I did say the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, so it's NCTSN.
Kate, I'm also thinking there's a document that the Teen Network led putting together after one of the community conversations that you and I were able to be part of for early childhood and thinking about COVID. But there are just a tremendous number of resources in that document.
Yes.
Get that out to folks. Everything that you just mentioned and lots more is in that very comprehensive document.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Lauren and I both said, we're happy to connect with anybody. I think we have our email addresses from this presentation because we know this is an important but very, very quick topic. What happens when parents don't follow through with rehab mental health but still communicate with child, which causes trauma after conversation? Yeah, so I mean, when I was doing clinical work, though, a lot of times kids aren't able to tell you why they're upset, but you understand their behavior through patterns, right? And so if there's a lot of distress after visits, really just trying to let the treatment team know about that. The family support team, so that the DSS is making decisions that are informed by that. And then, there are interventions where both the foster parents and the birth parents can get some supports around that. A lot of it is really around, education and support.
Yeah, and I think, this question, it sounds like someone was probably asking it from a child welfare perspective, but just, to add in, this is an issue that, that happens when outside the foster care system as well. So there are a lot of supports, and there's even some of the evidence-based practices have been used in a recovery world, and I believe we have some of those resources on that document. We can absolutely follow up. Do we want to turn it back over to Jane for the final word? I think we're 1 minute.
Yeah.
Sure. Lauren, Vidana, and Kate, holy cow, a spectacular presentation, packed full of information that is applicable to whatever your role is as a family member, as a clinician, as a educator, as a provider. Thank you so very much. We're going to close out with Tish McGinnis from Alabama, who is also co-chair of the National Early Childhood Family Network. Over to you, Tish.
Okay, everybody. I can't say anything again other than thank you to our technical assistants there at the University of Maryland. They are always wonderful for us on our webinars. For those of you that this is your first time for joining, please keep watching because we love being able to provide this kind of information to you. I want to say thank you to SAMHSA for the support that they've given to us and our network. Jane Walker, to you and Fredla, that we could not do this without, and especially to the presenters today, to Vidana, to Lauren and Kate. You guys rock. For everybody that has attended, thank you so much for joining us, and please reach out with any more questions, and any of us will be glad to get back with you and help as we can. Have a great holiday weekend.
Thank you, everybody. Be safe. Bye-bye.